Let's talk about the early hours of January 3rd, 2026. In the dead of night, a regime that had been in power for over a decade just vanished. But this wasn't some long, drawn-out war or a messy internal coup. Nope. It was a swift surgical military operation, with a timeline so incredibly tight, it might have just rewritten the rules of modern conflict. Today, we're breaking down exactly how it happened. This is the anatomy of Operation Absolute Resolve. 148. That number, 148 minutes, is at the absolute heart of this entire story. Think about that. From the second the first boots were on the ground at the target compound to the moment they flew away with their high-value targets, just 148 minutes went by. In that tiny window of time, a sitting head of state was taken into custody, flown completely out of his own country, and set on a direct path to a federal courtroom in New York City. So how in the world was this even possible? Well, here's our roadmap. We're going to walk through the anatomy of the operation itself, take a deep dive into the incredible multi-agency machine that pulled it off, and then unpack the massive legal debate that it kicked off. After that, we'll cover the cost, put it in historical context, and look at what happened to Venezuela right after. Okay, first things first, the United States was very careful not to call this an invasion or an act of war. Instead, officials are using a new term, regime interdiction. It's a whole new model that basically fuses hyper-advanced military force with what is, on paper, a law enforcement action. So what does that actually mean? Well, you really have to get this. The entire operation was legally framed as serving a Department of Justice warrant. It's kind of like a high-stakes fugitive recovery. The huge difference, and this is what makes it a genuine game changer, is that the fugitive was a sitting president and the recovery team included stealth bombers and Delta Force operators. All right, so how do you pull something like this off? How do you stick to that 148-minute timeline? Well, it all came down to a perfectly executed tactical sequence, what the military calls the kill chain. Every single step had to work flawlessly. And when you look at the timeline, the compression is just insane. So at 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time, the president gives the go-ahead. A little over 3 hours later, at 2 in the morning local time, the operation kicks off with a complete cyber attack that blacks out Caracas. Just 1 minute later, the ground teams are on site. And get this, by 3:29 a.m., the targets are already in the air, headed for a U.S. Navy ship. 2 days later, a former head of state is being formally arraigned in a U.S. court. So let's break that down step by step. First, U.S. Cyber Command hits the lights, plunging the city into darkness and total confusion. At the exact same time, the Air Force is systematically dismantling Venezuela's air defense system. With the skies now wide open, the elite 160th SOAR helicopters, the Night Stalkers, fly in low and fast to drop off the ground team, and then Delta Force breaches the compound in just 47 seconds, a time they perfected on a full-scale replica built in Kentucky, and they grab the targets for extraction. Now, pulling this off required a level of seamless cooperation you almost never see between the military and law enforcement. The whole thing was structured around 3 key roles: the enablers, who basically owned the airspace, the interdiction team, who were the boots on the ground, and the custodians, who handled the legal side of things. The enablers were this massive force of over 150 aircraft. Their whole job was to create a safe corridor. You had F-22s and F-35s taking out the advanced Russian-made S-300 air defense systems. You had the RQ-170 Sentinel, a stealth drone, providing constant ISR. That's just military speak for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, giving commanders eyes on the target at all times. And then, okay, so down on the ground, you had the interdiction force, the Army's Delta Force making the actual capture, flown in by the legendary Night Stalker pilots of the 160th. But working right alongside them were the custodians. The FBI's elite hostage rescue team was there for breaching support, and this is absolutely crucial. Once the targets were secured, they were handed over to the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. That handoff from military to law enforcement was the absolute linchpin of the entire U.S. legal argument. And that handoff really brings us to the central, most controversial question of this whole operation. What exactly was this? Was it an act of war? Or was it simply the most sophisticated and heavily armed police raid in human history? The U.S. position is pretty straightforward. Maduro was a fugitive from justice. He had a $50 million bounty on his head, and he was indicted by the Department of Justice on charges of narco-terrorism and conspiracy to import cocaine. So, in their view, this was just serving a valid warrant. Maduro's defense, on the other hand, claims he is a prisoner of war, captured in an act of state-on-state aggression, which means he should be protected by sovereign immunity. This quote from an after-action analysis, really nails the U.S. strategy. By framing the entire operation as law enforcement, the U.S. was trying to sidestep all of the complicated legal and political rules that come with a formal declaration of war, like the obligations under the Geneva Conventions.
All right, so let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the human cost and try to put the incredible speed of this operation into some historical context.
This was designed from the ground up to be a surgical, leadership-focused strike, and the casualty numbers really reflect that. Estimates are that between 23 and 47 Venezuelan forces were killed, along with 32 Cuban military personnel. Tragically, 2 civilians were also killed in the action. As for U.S. forces, there were 0 fatalities. And just to give you an idea of how mind-bogglingly fast this was, Operation Absolute Resolve is now on the books as the second shortest conflict in recorded history. The only one that was shorter, the Anglo-Zanzibar War, way back in 1896, which lasted a mere 38 minutes. So, with Maduro gone, the immediate aftermath was all about 2 things: stabilizing the country politically and, you guessed it, securing its massive but totally neglected energy resources. To really get why this was such a big deal on the world stage, you just have to look at the energy situation. The country's oil production had completely fallen off a cliff, dropping from a healthy 3 million barrels a day down to less than 1 million. For the rest of the world, fixing that was a huge priority. And just like the operation itself, the moves made right after were incredibly swift. A new acting president was sworn in almost immediately, an amnesty bill was passed, freeing hundreds of political prisoners, the U.S. Embassy in Caracas was reopened, and crucially, a new privatization law was passed, opening up the oil industry to foreign investment for the first time in decades. And that one law? It basically unlocked the door for what experts project could be $100 billion in new energy investments, all aimed at rebuilding the country's completely shattered infrastructure. Look, there's no denying the tactical brilliance here. It was a stunning success. But the precedent it sets is, well, it's staggering. It leaves all of us with a really profound question for the world we live in now. What happens to the whole idea of national sovereignty when a domestic criminal warrant can be used to justify a full-scale military operation against another country's leader? The fallout from that question is just beginning.